The coffee remark came in the middle of dessert at Magano's in Austin. My mother had just extinguished 61 candles while the family sang off-key. I sat at the far end of the long table, the usual spot reserved for me, right by the kitchen doors where waitstaff kept brushing my chair. "Claire, do you want some of this tiramisu?" she asked, sliding the dessert menu toward me. Before I could respond, my brother Ryan leaned back in his chair, that familiar smirk already forming. Does she even have money for coffee? I mean, how does someone survive on a warehouse paycheck? For a moment, silence blanketed the table before laughter erupted. "Ryan, stop," Mom said, but her smile remained. She always smiled when he cracked jokes at my expense. "I'm serious," Ryan continued, warming to the audience he always had. "Claire, what do you make? Around $35,000 a year before taxes, right?" He looked at his wife Megan. "Babe, isn't that about what we spend on your car payment?" Megan giggled into her wine glass. "And insurance," she added. I took a sip of water. "Something like that," I said quietly. "See, this is exactly what I mean," Ryan addressed the whole table. "No ambition, no drive. I was making six figures by 25, built an entire tech company from scratch. And here's Claire, still scanning boxes in a warehouse at 33. Dad nodded slowly. "Your brother has a point. When are you going to do something with your life?" "I'm doing fine," I murmured. "Fine?" Ryan laughed. "Fine is what people say when they've given up. Look at this place, Mom's birthday dinner, and you didn't even offer to help pay." "No, why?" "Because you can't even afford coffee here. Their espresso is $8. Lily spoke up. "It is pretty expensive, Claire. Maybe you should have suggested somewhere more budget-friendly." "I didn't pick the restaurant," I replied. "Because you never contribute to family decisions," Ryan said. "Why would we ask someone who can't afford to participate?" Uncle Thomas leaned forward. "Claire, it's not too late to go back to school. Get a real career. Ryan could probably give you some business advice." "I appreciate that," I said evenly, keeping my voice level. Ryan was on a roll now, relishing the audience. "Seriously, how do you survive? Rent, utilities, groceries, gas, it all adds up. You must be living paycheck to paycheck. That's no way to live." "I manage," I said. "Barely, I bet." He signaled the waiter. "Another bottle of the sis, please. The 2019. He turned back to me. "That's a $450 bottle, by the way. Just so you know what success tastes like." Megan touched his arm. "Ryan, maybe ease up a little." "What?" "I'm trying to motivate her. Someone has to." He fixed his gaze on me. "Claire, you're 33. Most people your age are buying homes, starting families, building wealth. You're just existing." Mom interjected. "Claire's always been practical. Not everyone needs to be a company founder." "Practical," Ryan scoffed. "Mom, there's practical, and then there's settling. Claire settled hard." I nodded slowly. "You're probably right." That seemed to satisfy him. He raised his glass. "Here's to Mom, 61 years young. And here's hoping Claire figures things out before she turns 61. Everyone clinked glasses. I lifted my water silently. The rest of the evening continued with Ryan holding court about his tech company, Next Tech Solutions. They had just closed Series B funding at $15 million, and he had been talking about it incessantly for months. Every gathering, every call, every text somehow circled back to his incredible success. "We're projecting $50 million in revenue next year," he said over coffee, the real coffee, which he deliberately offered to everyone except me. "Investors are thrilled. Series C could be in 18 months. Dad beamed. "That's my boy. Ryan's always been special." Mom agreed. "Even as a kid, we knew he'd do something amazing." I stayed quiet, checking my phone under the table. A message from my investment manager, Daniel Scott. "Need to discuss next tech position. Call Monday morning." I had been expecting this. Ryan had started Next Tech Solutions 4 years ago with 2 college friends. Big dreams, minimal capital, maximum arrogance. They developed a cloud-based software solution I never fully understood, because Ryan never bothered explaining beyond, "It's revolutionary, but you wouldn't get it." What Ryan didn't know, what no one in the family knew, was that I had been involved from the beginning, not as a supportive sister, but as his angel investor. When Ryan pitched to venture capital firms, he was repeatedly rejected. His product was too niche, his team inexperienced, his projections optimistic. After 6 months, he was broke and desperate. That's when I approached him through my firm, Sterling Ventures. I didn't use my real name. The firm managed everything via shell companies and proxies. On paper, his angel investor was SV Capital Holdings. In reality, it was me. I had put in $1 million of seed funding for 60% equity. Ryan thought he'd found a Silicon Valley investor who believed in his vision. He had no idea his warehouse working sister had become the majority shareholder. Over 4 years, I invested another $4,500,000 through funding rounds, keeping my 60% stake. When Ryan mentioned investors, he meant me. When celebrating Series B, most money came from funds I directed through partnerships. Total investment $5,500,000. Current valuation $78 million. My stake $55 million on paper. The warehouse job was technically real, mostly for health insurance and cover. My actual income came from a diversified investment portfolio I had been building since my early 20s, starting with a modest inheritance from my grandmother, grown to 8 figures through careful investing. I lived below my means intentionally, small apartment, old car, simple clothes. It prevented family questions and requests for money. But Ryan's behavior at dinner crossed a line. The public humiliation, constant belittling, making the family believe I was a failure, it had gone too far. After Ryan's endless boasting and the laughter around the table faded, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest. Everyone at that restaurant saw me as the failure, the one scraping by. Yet no one had any idea of the real picture. I had been careful for years, quietly building my life, my finances, my independence. Working the warehouse wasn't necessity, it was cover. Health insurance, routine, and the excuse to avoid unwanted questions about money. Behind the scenes, I had been Ryan's angel investor from the very beginning. 4 years ago, when his startup had been nothing but an ambitious idea pitched to uninterested venture capitalists, I stepped in. Using Sterling Ventures, I funneled money through shell companies and legal proxies. To him, SV Capital Holdings was some faceless Silicon Valley investor who believed in his vision. In truth, it was me. The first round was $1 million for 60% equity. Ryan had been desperate, on the verge of giving up, thinking he had finally found someone who trusted his revolutionary software. I watched silently as he believed in an illusion I controlled entirely. Over the next 4 years, another $4,500,000 flowed in through Series A and B rounds, carefully maintaining my majority stake. On paper, the total investment was $5,500,000. My current stake, based on Series B valuation, was $55 million. And yet, my life appeared ordinary to anyone observing from the outside. I had spent my early 20s transforming a modest inheritance from my grandmother into 8 figures. Conservative investments at first, index funds, blue-chip stocks, some real estate, later complemented by calculated risks in startups and growth equities. For 5 years, I worked multiple jobs, living on almost nothing, investing every spare dollar. The warehouse position fit perfectly into this plan, giving me plausible normalcy while my portfolio quietly multiplied. Ryan had no clue. My family had no clue. They assumed I was struggling, as my paycheck suggested. That night, watching him toast success and belittle me, I reminded myself of the purpose behind all my secrecy. I wasn't trying to prove anything to them yet. I wasn't flaunting wealth or status. I wanted freedom from expectations, from their scrutiny, from unsolicited advice about how to spend or earn. It was a delicate balance. I could invest and grow capital without scrutiny because the warehouse job provided plausible modest income. I lived frugally, tiny apartment, old car, plain clothes, not from necessity, but by design. It kept my life private, my decisions mine, and my wealth discreet. Ryan's comments tonight crossed a line. Mocking, belittling, performing superiority in front of everyone. It was a public humiliation I would not let slide. I sipped water, keeping my expression neutral while mentally running through the numbers. I could liquidate my stake if I wanted, exercise control, or quietly redirect the company's trajectory without him ever suspecting my hand in it. For years of carefully measured investments and oversight put me in a position of absolute authority. The irony that he bragged about achievements I had funded made my pulse steady, not fast. No one at that table knew that the person they assumed to be barely surviving was controlling the fate of the company Ryan believed defined his success. It was a strange sense of power, not for ego, not for vengeance, but for clarity and eventual justice. I had built this as a private insurance policy for myself, to maintain autonomy in a family that too often equated visibility with worth. And yet, I couldn't let tonight go unanswered. The humiliation wasn't just personal, it was performative, meant to enforce their perception of me. I would let them continue seeing the surface, while the real truth simmered beneath. They assumed my life was simple, my job mundane, my success non-existent. The truth was, I had been orchestrating a much larger picture. Ryan's Next Tech Solutions, the company he praised endlessly, thrived only because of my careful, hidden intervention. The warehouse shift tomorrow wouldn't change anything. It was part of the routine, a grounding in simplicity. But the knowledge I held, the quiet authority over the very company he championed, gave me a calm sense of justice. I had quietly built wealth, security, and influence without drama, yet now I had to decide how and when to reveal it. Tonight, I let the dinner pass, observing reactions, measuring every comment, and preparing for what was coming. This duality, visible struggle versus hidden power, was my life. It had kept me safe, focused, and unnoticed. But there were limits to how long I would tolerate derision and public belittling. One day, the scales would tip, and everyone would learn that the person they assumed powerless had quietly been holding the reins all along. Monday morning began with a call that had the power to collapse the world I had meticulously built. Richard, my investment manager, was on the line. Claire, about the next tech position. His voice carried the usual professional calm, but I had anticipated this. I cut through the formalities. Execute the exit. All of it. The silence stretched across the line. Everything? Are you certain? Series C could triple the valuation. I didn't flinch. I'm certain. Start divestment immediately. Richard hesitated. You're the majority shareholder. Removing your capital will force them to find replacement funding or face serious operational consequences. I acknowledged him simply. I understand. Within minutes, the legal wheels started turning. The call was precise, methodical. I gave instructions for a clean exit, full recovery of invested capital plus standard returns, 30 days for the company to buy me out or secure replacement investors. If they failed, liquidation would follow. It was the standard framework, but the impact was about to be seismic. I went about my day at the warehouse, mundane in comparison to the silent tremor I had unleashed. The shift was real, yet my mind kept running numbers, timelines, contingencies. I was calm because I had anticipated this moment for years. Ryan's arrogance had created a vulnerability that was now irreversible. At 10:52 a.m., his call came. Panic laced his voice. Claire, SB Capital is pulling out. All $5,500,000. We don't have the liquidity. The company, it's collapsing. I stayed composed. I'm sorry, Ryan. That's a reality now. His voice rose, disbelief and desperation mixed together. For years of work, all gone. Why? We're performing perfectly. I let the silence stretch. Perhaps priorities changed. That's business. Can we find other investors in 30 days? His tone was almost incredulous. Insane, I said quietly. You're not ready for a Series C pitch. Potential investors now see desperation, not confidence. Your minor stakeholders will follow suit. You're exposed. He stammered, grasping at straws. What about the Series B investors? I explained the implications calmly. A majority shareholder exit signals catastrophic loss of confidence, triggering a chain reaction. We're dead in the water, he admitted finally. For a moment, I let him absorb it. Then, predictably, he asked to borrow money. I reminded him of the irony, the warehouse worker now dictating the survival of his company. The legal process moved swiftly. Notices were dispatched, shareholder agreements activated. Every step was standard procedure, yet the reality hit him with full force. My exit wasn't personal, it was business. Yet he felt the personal weight because he had never anticipated that the person he had belittled controlled the majority stake. By the end of the day, he was in full crisis mode. His voice, usually confident, now trembled with urgency, the veneer of invincibility stripped away. I stayed detached, noting the effectiveness of the actions I had set in motion. 30 days to either stabilize or fail. He now lived inside the framework I had prepared. Throughout this, I maintained the cover of normalcy. Warehouse tasks, routine orders, mundane coworkers. It was the camouflage that allowed me to wield influence quietly. No one around me suspected that the ordinary employee overseeing crates was the majority shareholder capable of toppling a tech company with a single decision. Richard kept me updated on legal notifications, confirmations, and the projected consequences. The company had mere weeks to secure alternative funding. The panic was real, measurable, and entirely expected. I felt a detached satisfaction, knowing the magnitude of the lesson he was about to internalize. By late afternoon, I reflected on the situation. The crisis was now visible to Ryan, his immediate circle, and the rest of the family. The dominoes I had anticipated were beginning to fall. The complexity of the situation was manageable from my end, because every contingency had been considered. Yet from his perspective, it was chaos, exactly how it needed to feel. I had effectively placed the responsibility on his shoulders. The majority shareholder's exit forced him to face the reality of business, relationships, and humility. 30 days to act, to negotiate, to save what he had assumed was untouchable. Every choice, every conversation, every plea for help would now be framed by the knowledge that the person he dismissed was in control. And in that quiet reflection, I reminded myself, this wasn't about revenge, nor ego. It was about clarity, consequence, and balance. Ryan had performed publicly at the expense of my dignity. Now the lesson would be delivered at a scale that matched his hubris. And I would remain steady, invisible to the chaos, the master of the very forces he had underestimated. By Wednesday, the news had already started rippling through the family network. Rumors of the imploding company had leaked, and those who had once praised Ryan's genius were now on edge. Texts and calls from siblings, aunts, uncles, even cousins, asking for clarity, started arriving nonstop. I silenced my phone and kept my focus on the warehouse floor, knowing I had orchestrated every move carefully. Mom called for an emergency family dinner, this time at her house, not a fancy restaurant. The atmosphere was tense, chairs pulled up around the familiar kitchen table, yet nothing felt familiar. Ryan's face had aged rapidly over the past few days, his skin was pale, and the hollowness in his eyes betrayed sleepless nights and worry. Jessica clutched his hand, her concern palpable, but even her presence couldn't mask the fear emanating from him. Dad initiated the meeting. Ryan, explain where things stand, he urged, trying to maintain control. Ryan cleared his throat, voice trembling. The company is failing. Bankruptcy proceedings start in 2 weeks. Our assets are leveraged against the shares. Everything we built, gone. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It must be recoverable somehow, she said. Her voice wavered with disbelief and hope. Ryan shook his head. It's over. The major investor pulled out, $500,000. That triggered a chain reaction. The other investors are following suit. There's no restructuring possible without replacement capital. Uncle Richard leaned forward. Can you identify the investor? Any negotiation possible? Ryan's voice faltered. It's a shell company. My legal team says the exit is fully within their rights. Ironclad shareholder agreement. Silence fell. Sarah looked at me. Claire, didn't you study business at community college? Do you understand this? I nodded. An angel investor provides early-stage funding in exchange for equity. If they hold a majority and pull out, it signals instability to other investors, triggering exits. It's a cascading effect. Ryan stared at me, a flicker of realization crossing his face. Mom asked cautiously, but why would they invest if they didn't trust the company? 4 years ago, maybe they believed in it, I said. Priorities change, liquidity needs shift. Business isn't static. He looked down at his hands, recalling the long hours and sacrifices. 4 years, gone in an instant because someone changed their mind. Jessica's quiet voice asked about his co-founders. They're seeking new jobs, he admitted. Smart move. They at least have startup experience. The failure lands on me. The room was thick with tension. Uncle Richard broke the silence. How much would it take to stabilize the company? At least $6 million to buy out the exiting shareholder and maintain operations. But no one will invest in a company actively collapsing. Ryan's voice was flat, defeated. What about family resources? Sarah suggested, uncertain. Ryan laughed bitterly. Resources? Dad's retired. Mom's on a fixed income. Richard, your business is your own. Sarah, loans. And Claire, his gaze landed on me. You work in a warehouse. I spoke softly. It's not your fault. He nodded, his expression unexpectedly sincere. You're probably the only one here who never pretended to be something else. At least you're honest. Mom began to cry. Dad embraced her. Jessica stared at the table. Sarah checked her phone nervously. I stood, excusing myself. Out on the back porch, I called Richard Chin. Claire, 30 days. I asked. Can we compress the timeline? Offer a buyback at a reduced valuation? You want to help him? Richard asked. I want this clean, I replied. What would be fair? He considered. Given the distress, $3.2 million is reasonable. Below your total investment, but it offers him a chance to stabilize if he secures bridge financing. Send it tonight, I ordered. One condition, full disclosure of the investor's identity. No more shells. At 8:47 p.m., the email reached Ryan. I watched as confusion and disbelief swept across his face. Slowly, he spoke. SV Capital Holdings, the angel investor, the majority shareholder, it's you? The room erupted. Impossible. Claire works in a warehouse. I confirmed calmly. I do, but I also control a diversified investment portfolio worth about $80 million. Your company represents roughly $46 million on paper. Silence fell, broken only by Sarah's stunned whisper. Ryan sank into his chair, realization dawning. You funded every stage. Series A and B, 60% ownership, all this time? Yes, I said. Your execution was solid, market timing right. A smart investment. But you let everyone believe I was poor, a failure. Ryan's head in his hands. Every insult, every joke. I treated you like nothing. I shook my head. Not anymore. I'm not the failure. I built wealth quietly, without humiliation or condescension. The lesson was clear. He had underestimated the person he mocked. Now, everyone in the room saw it. The dynamic shifted in silence, heavy with disbelief, respect, and a grudging understanding. The room had been silent for what felt like hours, everyone digesting the revelation. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to the phone in my hand. The 30-day clock was ticking, and the first step was clear, an offer. I called Richard Chin, outlining the buyback terms with precision. Offer him $3.2 million, I said, and make it clear he can only save the company if he acts decisively. The rest of the family watched me, still in shock, as if waiting for a sign that I might relent. I didn't. Derek's eyes were wide, not with anger, but with the sudden gravity of the situation. You want to help him? Richard asked. No, I answered firmly. I want this to be clean, fair, and transparent. If he succeeds, it's entirely on him. Minutes stretched into tense discussion as the email went out, and I observed Derek's face as it transformed from confusion to disbelief. SV Capital Holdings, it's you, he asked quietly, his voice betraying a tremor of awe. The room erupted, a mix of disbelief, gasps, and hurried questions. I remained calm, letting them piece it together. Yes, the investor who had funded every stage of his company, who controlled the majority shares, had been me all along. The conversation shifted quickly from shock to reality. Derek realized he had a lifeline, but only if he moved with speed and humility. I explained the conditions clearly. Bridge financing must be secured, the buyback option had to be exercised, and transparency with investors was non-negotiable. No more shell companies, no more hiding. The family, still processing, began to see the layers of the lesson. Mom's tears were quiet, reflective rather than accusatory. Dad remained steady, absorbing the implications. Even Sarah hesitated, then asked the right questions about the mechanics of the offer. Derek, now with a heavy sense of responsibility, nodded slowly. He understood the stakes, the lesson, and the opportunity. You have 30 days, I said. Pitch the company like your life depends on it. It does. Be humble. Remember what it feels like to be underestimated. Don't repeat the mistakes you've made with people you consider beneath you. Derek exhaled, a mixture of gratitude and shame. I will, he said softly. I promise. I shook my head slightly, not needing his verbal commitment. Don't promise me, I replied. Promise yourself, and everyone you've ever dismissed. This is your chance to do it differently. Over the next few weeks, Derek and his team worked frantically. The buyback offer provided clarity and motivation. He reached out to his co-founders and industry contacts, rebuilding trust and credibility. Slowly, the tension in the family eased as everyone recognized that this crisis had sparked more than panic. It sparked growth and accountability. When Derek called after 28 days, his exhaustion was palpable, but so was relief. The consortium of investors had agreed to the bridge financing, buying out my stake at the discounted rate. He had retained control, albeit with a smaller share. The company survived. "We're going to make it," he said, voice tight but sincere. "Thank you." I allowed a small smile. "You earned it. Remember what we talked about." The family gradually adjusted. Derek's condescension faded, replaced by measured respect. Conversations at dinners no longer revolved solely around his achievements. Mom and Dad stopped treating me like I needed saving or scrutiny. Sarah began seeking my advice, curious and respectful rather than judgmental. Uncle Richard, quietly reflective, apologized for past dismissive remarks. I realized the biggest shift was internal. Years of hiding my success had been exhausting, a strategy to avoid judgment and requests for help. Forcing my achievements into the open, on my terms, was liberating. I could live openly, unapologetically, without performing or explaining myself constantly. I was successful, strategic, and generous, and my family had to acknowledge it. A year later, Derek's company went public. The IPO was modest but successful. His reduced stake still secured him wealth, and he raised a glass at the celebration dinner. "To the smartest investor I know," he said, nodding at me. "The sister I should have appreciated from the start." I smiled, sipping my coffee, reflecting on the warehouse shift scheduled for the next day, not for money, but for simplicity, honesty, and grounding. Success, I thought, wears many faces. It took the family years to understand, but eventually, they did. The final days of the buyback process stretched tense and quiet, with the clock counting down the 30-day window I had set. Derek, exhausted and humbled, worked tirelessly to line up bridge financing with a consortium of investors, the reality of his own vulnerability finally settling in. Each call he made, every pitch he rehearsed, carried a weight I had only imagined. I stayed out of his way but observed from the sidelines, content to see the lessons he had avoided learning for so long take root. When the deal was finalized, it was understated. Derek secured the funds, bought out my position at the discounted rate, and the company remained under his control, though with a reduced stake. There was no grand announcement, no fanfare, just the quiet relief of survival. He called me afterward, voice ragged but sincere. "We're going to make it," he admitted. I didn't need to respond with more than a calm, "I'm glad," and meant it fully. The aftermath of that dinner, the years of public humiliation and private patience, settled into a new family dynamic. Derek, no longer the infallible golden child, began to treat everyone around him with a measure of humility he had never shown. At subsequent family gatherings, his stories about the company's milestones no longer dominated the room. He asked questions, listened, and for the first time, valued perspectives other than his own. Mom and Dad stopped treating me as if I were fragile or in need of guidance. Sarah began asking for advice, genuinely curious about investment strategies, and Uncle Richard apologized for every dismissive comment he had ever made. For me, the experience was quietly liberating. I no longer needed to hide my success behind a modest apartment and an old car. My investments, including my majority stake in Derek's company, continued to grow. I continued working part-time at the warehouse, not out of necessity, but for the simplicity and honesty it provided, a grounding routine that reminded me who I was outside of family expectations and societal definitions of success. My wealth was a tool, not a performance. A year later, Derek's company went public. The IPO was modest but successful. His reduced stake still secured him financial comfort, and he carried himself with a humility earned through experience. At the celebration dinner, he raised a glass toward me, acknowledgement in his eyes. "To you," he said, "the smartest investor I know, and the sister I should have appreciated from the start." The room echoed with clinks of glasses. I lifted my own, a quiet smile forming as I sipped my $8 coffee, thinking of the shift I had scheduled for the next day, not because of money, but because of the satisfaction in honest, unpretentious work. Success, I reflected, wears many faces. It can be loud and public, or quiet and strategic. It doesn't always announce itself, and sometimes those who seem least capable hold the greatest power. It took years for my family to understand that lesson, but they did. Derek learned it as well, through humility, consequence, and the recognition that the value of a person cannot always be measured in dollars or outward achievement. And I learned that revealing one's success on one's own terms could be profoundly freeing. I could live my life fully, strategically, and generously, without the burden of pretension or expectation, while remaining unshaken by others' definitions of worth. The warehouse shift the next morning felt different than ever before. I moved through the aisles with ease, confident in my knowledge of investments and ownership, yet grounded in the rhythm of ordinary labor. It reminded me that wealth and accomplishment are meaningful not because they are visible, but because they allow freedom, control, and integrity. And in that clarity, I felt complete. My family's view of me had shifted, but more importantly, my own understanding of myself had finally aligned with reality. Success was mine to define, and for the first time I did so entirely on my own terms.